surrounded by lighter background fabrics on the other. The blocks were arranged on point so that all the right angles of the triangles, large and small, pointed in the same direction. The fabrics themselves seemed to be primarily muslins and wools, so faded and worn that Sylvia could only guess their original colors. Water stains and deterioration suggested age as well as rough handling, as did the muted colors of the once bright dyes and the worn binding through which the cotton batting was visible. Fine stipple quilting held the three layers together, where they were still held together. Elsewhere, the thread had been removed or torn out by accident, and the middle batting layer it should have held in place was long gone. Only a reluctance to appear hypocritical prevented Sylvia from scolding Margaret for risking further damage to the quilt by bringing it to the Quilt Guild meeting, for Sylvia was very glad to see it. "It's lovely, dear." She bent closer and peered through her bifocals at the quilting stitches. There was something unusual about them, something she couldn't yet place. "Lovely," Margaret laughed. "Most people look at it and say, interesting." "You can tell Sylvia's a true quilter," said Andrew. "She never fails to see through the wear and tear and find the beauty." "True beauty stands the test of time," said Sylvia, straightening. "Although I must say it's a pity its previous owners didn't take better care of it." "I know," said Margaret apologetically. "But my mother says it was just one of many quilts her grandmother had around the house. They didn't realize they were sleeping under a family heirloom." "Of course not. I'm not faulting you or your ancestors. I'm not one of those who believes quilts should be showpieces kept safely away from anyone's bed." Sylvia returned her gaze to the quilt. "It's a simple pattern pieced from scraps. It wasn't intended as the family's best quilt. I'd say by using it so well, your family was acting well within the quilt maker's wishes." Margaret smiled, pleased. Then Andrew caught Sylvia's eye, and she was suddenly aware of how her lecture had wearied her, and how long they planned to drive before stopping for the night. She couldn't imagine what possible connection the quilt could have to Elm Creek Manor, unless Margaret hoped Sylvia would buy it and display it there. Briskly, she said, "Now, were you looking for an appraisal of the quilt or an estimate of its age? If so, I'm afraid I can't help you. I could place it in the mid to late 19th century, but you'll need to consult a textiles expert for a more precise answer. As for what it's worth in terms of dollars and cents—" "Oh, I could never sell it," said Margaret, shocked. "I'm pleased to hear that." Sylvia wished all families would show such appreciation for the heirloom quilts their foremothers had so lovingly made. "Then tell me, what did you mean by a connection between this quilt and my home?" Margaret turned the quilt so that only the solid muslin backing was visible. "When you look at the quilting stitches, what do you see?" Pursing her lips, Sylvia carefully scrutinized the quilt. Without the distraction of color and pattern, the stitches were more clearly visible. "The stippling pattern isn't consistent," she said. "Some of the stitches are long, others quite small, and the small ones seem to be grouped together." Margaret's nod told Sylvia she had responded just as the younger woman had hoped. "When I told my mother I had attended quilt camp at Elm Creek Manor, she told me that she had an old family quilt her grandmother had called the Elm Creek quilt." Sylvia looked up in surprise. "Did she indeed?" "At first I thought its name came from the quilting pattern used in the border. See the elm leaf motif, and how these wavy lines looked like running water?" "I suppose." Sylvia saw the leaves now that they had been pointed out, but in her opinion, the wavy lines resembled a common cable pattern more than a creek. "It had another name, too, the Runaway quilt." "Runaway?" Andrew chuckled. "I've heard of quilters getting carried away with their work, but I didn't know a quilt could actually run away." "Perhaps the quilt turned out much larger than its maker had intended," said Sylvia. "Perhaps she felt it ran on with a life of its own." "Maybe, but my mother says it was most often called the Elm Creek quilt," said Margaret hastily. Sylvia nodded and exchanged an amused glance with Andrew. Margaret seemed most eager to prove her point, but she had said nothing yet to persuade Sylvia. "Now, look at these designs." Margaret pointed out groups of stitches that